In this video, I'm just going to run through a quick little demo character setup. This is a little character that I made for a little side project. Skin weighting is pretty bad right now, so you can ignore deformation when I get moving him around. So the one kind of unique thing with this rigging system is that it requires every joint to exist before it can do its thing. It's like a lot of rigging systems, if we were going to build a reverse foot, the skeletal structure for that reverse foot would be created only in the rigging component. But with the freeform rigging kind of style, we don't know. Well, we want to be able to rig anything at any time. And the tools don't essentially create their own structure, they just work off of the structure that's already there. So if we're going to do a reverse foot on a character, the first thing we'll need to do is create that joint structure. Actually, I don't like that these... Yeah, I'll leave them alone. I don't like that those joints that aren't quite on the ground, but it's just being nitpicky. So here I'm just creating your standard like zigzagged reverse foot bone structure. It gives us a pivot point on the heel. And we'll go ahead and move all of these down. It gives us a pivot point on each side of the foot and the heel. And we'll use an IK we'll use this to control the leg IK so that we can rotate on the toes and the ball of the toe, or the ball of the foot, will stay planted and we'll raise the ankle. I can go ahead and just duplicate this. Delete that. I'm going to use a little bit of a trick here. I'm going to go ahead and parent this into a central joint so that I can go ahead and do naming is always important. Alright, now I can go to skeleton, mirror my joints, cross the YZ, go by behavior, we'll look for underscore L, replace it with underscore R. And then I just parent that in. It's a little bit of a cheater way of creating that joint structure identical on both sides. Alright, so now that I've got that foot structure set up, the first step in setting up any character here is to kind of borrow the term from Motion Builder called Characterize It. It's really just the process that sets it up as a character to the rigging system. With the tools install, you'll have a marking menu off of Control-Alt. It's a context-sensitive marking menu, so nothing shows up if you don't have anything selected. If I have a joint selected, Control-Alt left-click will bring up a radial menu. And Characterize Skeleton is on the bottom here. This is a way to interact with the rigs as well. So when you select like an FK component, there will be an option to switch it over to IK and vice versa. All the stuff that appears over here more or less also appears in the marking menu just for quick access. But if you want to use code, you can also run this snippet. It's just freeform utils, character utils, characterize skeleton. First object is just any joint in the skeleton. The name of the character. If you don't provide a name, it will pop up a little UI prompting you to enter a name for the character. and then whether or not to update the helix rigger after the character was made. So I'll just grab this, hit characterize skeleton, call him demo. So this populates the scene. Let's see, let me bring up the node editor. Populates the scene with a metadata network that's tracking everything that's in your character. Right now, it's just tracking all the joints. And our metadata network is pretty simple, but all of the rigging will hang off of this rig core, and this gives us a kind of consolidated location to read up and down this tree to find different pieces of the rig, different pieces of the character, to find all characters in the scene. That allows for a lot of automated search and manipulation of the character and rig, and it's kind of how the code interacts with everything, is reading through this metadata network. So it sets all that up, but it also sets up some initial properties on all of your joints. So now if you go to the attribute editor, you'll see an export property on every joint, and in extra attributes, you'll see a little export flag. So when I export the skeleton, I don't actually want any of these reverse foot joints to export with it. I don't want the animation from any of that to carry through. So I'm just going to come in here and flag these as no export. So when the exporter runs, it duplicates off the skeleton, reads through all the properties, and if it runs into one that's no export, it just deletes it and clears it out of the skeleton, so you don't have to worry about it. That lovely unwrapped texture. So with that set up, the rigging system uses this idea of tagging regions on the skeleton to inform the UI, inform the tools, how things can be rigged, how things can be made. So, for instance, there's a little UI editor to help build these regions. So, for instance, we'll start with the center of the character. We'll call it center. The grouping here is just the grouping within the UI. It will group everything with the same group name into the same little collapsible group in the UI for you. Then the region, we'll call this the spine. The spine is from spine 1 up to spine 4. We'll add. So just like the export property, this adds additional properties that you can find off of the attribute editor, rig markup. This tells it that this is the spine. It's the end of the spine. That's the torso group, and the side is called center. For coloring purposes, we use center, left, and right. But there is some advanced features to define shaders for your control shapes specific to the side name, however you want and whatever side names you want to use. So we have the spine. We can just continue our way up the chain here. Let's do the neck and head separate. So the neck is just neck 1 and 2. We'll add. The head doesn't have a second joint. It's just the head. I do have a cog joint on this character that's separate. So I'm actually going to modify this cog joint, because I want the cog to be colored differently than everything else, just for readability. So I'm just going to give it its own side name. Anything that doesn't have a center left or right is colored yellow. Center is blue, left to right are red and green. Kind of your standard rigging colors. So now I can move off to the legs. We'll call this the left leg. Oh. And it would help if I don't modify the cog here. Actually, we'll just leave out the group here. Anything that doesn't have a group name will end up in the miscellaneous tab. So I want to do a new region. I don't want to edit the cog. Left, legs, leg. And these names are just human usable, whatever you want to call them. This doesn't have to be called the left leg. This could be called the left lower appendage or whatever you want to call it. This is just, again, the rigging system uses this tagging information. So say I have a character, I have a bunch of bipeds in my characters that are slightly different, but I want to use essentially the same rigging on all of them. Whatever their joints are named, doesn't really matter. We can call this 3-joint chain that makes up the leg, the left leg in the rigging system on all of our characters. And it will apply the rigging in that same consistent way on all of the characters. So we'll add the left leg. Left foot would go from the ankle to that heel joint of the reverse foot chain, since we want to rig that with the reverse foot. And you could also do a FK foot. That's just the foot and the ball of the foot if you want to. These regions can overlap. You can use them however you want. So if you don't want all the extra controls when you build this foot as an FK, and you just want the ankle and the ball to rig as an FK, you can make a separate region just for those two. We have arms. We have a clavicle. And we have an arm. And I'm going to leave off all the fingers for now, because that's just a lot of tedious defining of each individual finger, and we don't need to show you that. So with the left side done, we can actually go ahead and mirror left to right. This will look for joint names, kind of like a skeletal mirroring. So we'll look for _L in the joint, look for the same joint with _R in it, and then replace the left side name with the right side name. Just a little hiccup in the tools there. So the one issue that I ran into is this mirrored filtered regions mirrors things off of what you have filtered. And this is a bug that I will fix, but if you try to mirror things with the name left, and there are regions that aren't called left or don't have the name left in them, it complains and errors out. So if you want to mirror left to right, first filter left, then replace left with right, joint name search, and then hit mirror. Now you've got right arm. If you want to see exactly what joints each of these are, you can check highlight. If you don't check highlight, nothing shows up in the viewport. If you check highlight, it will select the joints that are making up this chain. So you can see left arm, or the right arm, the right foot, the right FK foot, and that right leg all set up as the joints that we're looking for. So with region setup done, we are actually all ready to start rigging. First thing I do is save a settings file. And the settings file is the definition of all the properties, the state the property is in, so like the export true or false, all the region markup, the 0 position of the skeleton, pretty much everything that makes up this skeleton and defines this character skeleton is saved off in the settings file. Let's call it settings demo, whatever you want to call it. I generally just put settings in the name. I'll take a quick peek at that file to show you what gets saved off. All these are just JSON files, so they're pretty human readable. So you can see here, the file type is a settings file. It's a rigging type file, and it's not a variant, it's just the base character. The variant is something that's only editable by going into the details and manually editing it. There's not a tools way of editing it. I'll get into that in a different video. Then we have the skeleton and the cog for one. What the parent object is, what the bind transforms are, all the properties that are on that joint, and then the transforms themselves. The bind transform and the transform themselves would generally be the same, but they don't have to be. And just again, just to list through all the joints. So there's one really handy extra little bit of functionality that I find I use a lot when, well, not use a lot, but makes a really easy mistake easy to fix when setting up a character. That is, if you haven't already zeroed out all of your joints or before you started your skin weighting, sometimes you'll have rotations on the joints. And that can be kind of a pain to try to fix, because you can't freeze the skeletal transforms while they're attached to a skin cluster or while they're attached to a mesh. But using that settings file, I actually have a process called freeze character. Note that it is not undoable, so this is a kind of a one-way street. But this process actually duplicates off the skeleton, freezes the duplicate skeleton, saves the settings file off of that frozen skeleton, and then that captures all of that transforming information that's saved in that file. So all of your joint orients, all of your rotates that make that character a frozen, or in that frozen state, are saved off in that file. And then I can just load those rotations back onto this character. And the freeze character process just does all of that. If you've started working on your character, starting your setup, and then you realize, I forgot to zero my skeleton, it's not a headache to go through and unbind your mesh and make sure you have a saved version and do a bunch of manual work to try to refreeze it and save all your skinning weight. This just saves off all the information that would make that skeleton frozen and then reloads it very easily. So with the regions all populated, we now have a drop down with each one of the regions here, and then a way of rigging. FK, IK, reverse foot are generally going to be the ones you use mostly. Aim FK is aim constraint based FK system, so it kind of simulates a spline without being a spline. It's something that was thrown in for fun that I saw a little demo of Rick Lico in one of his little animation things. I thought it'd be a good way of testing this animation system to see if I could introduce that kind of behavior. And it went pretty well. For the most part, we'll stick with FK and IK. So let's do, there's a little search here. If you just want to search for center, or if you just want to specifically search for the spine, you can quickly filter that list. Those lists can get pretty big. You can also search for left arm specifically. So I'll start with all the center controls. This world space and remove existing determine kind of the settings of what happens when you apply rigging. The remove existing will, I'll just show you. If I rig this as an FK, I now have control shapes underneath here. And let's do a little bit of cleanup. Good, all those constraints got put down below it. This is just my personal preference to get the selection of all that stuff out of my way. So now I can only select the rig controls. So rigging that in FK gives you a set of rig controls. They're ready to go. Right now you can see their boxes inside the character. In a minute I'll go through how to shape those out and get them saved out so that you can essentially make whatever shape you want and use those as control shapes. But before I do that, I like setting up the character and just having the rig in a good state before doing all those little detailed controls. So remove existing will, when I apply rigging again, bake down that skeleton or that rig that's applied and then build a new one. And if I don't do remove existing, it will do a layered rig setup. And this would be something like if you want the arm to be in IK and FK at the same time and the ability to key switches between them. You could build the arm in FK, uncheck remove existing, build IK, and it would build two rig controls that are constrained, have the shared kind of constraint over the deformation skeleton. World space is primarily for the rig skeleton joints. And sometimes, since I need the joints to be part of the hierarchy all the time, but we don't always want them to behave as though they're part of the hierarchy. Sometimes we want them to behave as essentially a floating joint in space that we're using as a control. For a general biped, there's no reason to do that, but for like a reverse leg, like dog leg character, there are some controls. And again, a future video, I'll go over that kind of thing. There's some controls where you'd want to check world space. Actually, the reverse foot is one case where we will be checking world space, just because we want that to essentially be an IK control handle that's connected off of the foot that's essentially controlling the IK handle itself. So we want that to be set in world space. We want pelvis, the head, the neck, yes, let's do arms. We'll start with FK arms. And clavicles too. I am going to turn off that animation cache so that it doesn't keep rebuilding itself every time I modify something that's not an animation. Next to the legs, we want an IK. And for each component that gets built, regardless of what state this character is in, so if the character is animated, the rig is going to transfer all animation up to itself whenever it builds. So that's why some of this takes a little bit long, because it's doing a lot of baking. But once you have the rig set and you're using a rigging file, I consolidate all of the baking commands so that we don't have to bake over and over and over and over, like what it's doing right now when I'm building them individually. Then we have the foot, the rest foot, and reverse foot, and world space, the rig. Oh, I actually forgot a joint in the skeleton. So that errored on me. That's okay. This is actually a good chance to show you something pretty simple. The rig setup. So as rigs get made, they get built into each of their own groups. So the head gets its own group. The spine's probably a better one to look at. So spine, you got your deformation controlling joints. And then you have the rig controls with all their 0 objects underneath them. And you'll find that for every single type of rigging component. So I had an error because I didn't actually have the correct joints for this reverse foot to build. I'm missing one of them, as I said. It's really easy to be like, this thing failed, so I'm just going to come in here and delete it. Then, when that reverse foot builds, it actually hides the toes for you. Let's unhide this. I'm going to go ahead and unhide that. So the joint that I'm missing is the IK handle off of the tip of the toe. And this will let you do the kind of toe wag up and down. And that's just the control position for that. Again, since the rigging system only works with what is currently, what currently exists, we have to define everything. So even though this is just like a little floating control that's going to control an IK handle, or not, a single jointed IK handle the reverse foot is using, I still need the joint to exist in the skeleton. So what I'm going to do here is, I kind of don't want to modify the skeleton while things are rigged. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of save a bookmark of my progress so far. So rigging, save, demo guy. And this error has to do with me deleting that toe. Oh, that's right. Let's see, Windows, Node Editor. I forgot to select one thing when I was deleting that toe. So, if I go to the node editor here and select this demo character, select map inputs. This is the top level network node for the character. This is the network node that will have all of our controls. So I know right now, just from looking at that error, that I will find the reverse foot component right here. So this is telling the rigging system that it's expecting a reverse foot component, and that there should be stuff in here. I don't want to delete the joints, but I want to get rid of this network that's telling the rigging system that that should exist. Alright, and we're back in business. Alright, so I'm also going to go ahead and set this character's rigging path. So the rigging path, if you look at this demo character, go to the attribute editor, there'll be a little demo here. It's actually all correct. Oh, let's just save. Oh. I guess my file did not save. That must have been an error that threw. Okay, so now I have demo. This is a rig file. Again, it's just a markup that tells it what region, like center, head, it should be built as an FK. It's not in world space, and so on for all the different region markups that you've done. This informs the rigging system how to rebuild this rig as it stands right now. If I select the character here, this selects everything. Then I can just hit X and it will remove all my components. And off the right click menu here, you notice that these joints that I duplicated don't have any of their markup. They don't have all the connections that say I'm a part of this character yet. Well, this pelvis didn't get selected because of the selection mode. This is only select keyed objects, so there are sometimes, like with the IK leg and a reverse leg setup, that I don't actually ever want to select and modify the IK handle because it's being controlled by the reverse foot component. So as long as there aren't any keys on that, this little flag here tells it to not select anything. And this is to not select at all, no matter what. This is just unlock, so select everything. So now everything is unselected. And you can toggle that broadly on every object you have selected by toggling these. So to add a joint, all you have to do is right click, hit add new joints. You'll see it's got the export property, it's connected into the joints now. We'll go to the export property and not export these as well. Settings. We'll resave the settings file to include those joints in that markup. Go back to rigging, load profile, load demo. I'll go ahead and just unlock everything. So we're back to where we had left off. Little bug fixed. Character is re-rigged, reset up, ready to go again. So let's try again. Right foot. World space, reverse foot. There we go. So this is the control for the joint that we were missing. That's that little IK toe wiggle control that you can get in a reverse foot. So now we have a reverse foot, but it's not connected to, or the IK leg isn't connected to it yet. And that's really the last thing we need to do here to get this all working. And that's where we introduce the constraining system of this rig system, which is also our space switching system and a bunch of other things. It's kind of the glue that holds everything together. So with the reverse foot, this one is a little bit, I guess, tedious to set up the first time, but once you have a rigging file saved with it set up, you never have to touch this again. So you never have to do this manual process ever again. But until you have that rigging file saved in the reverse foot, there is an attachment point. That's a hidden object. It's just the end of the reverse foot structure. So the reverse foot, the skeleton flows down from the ankle to the heel. The reverse foot flows from the heel up to the ankle. So the last joint in that chain is this attachment point. So I'm going to go ahead and select that. And then I'm going to select the control of the IK. Then we have different types of overdrivers. So this one just says take the first object you selected and make it control all of the objects you have selected after that. This is another one where I will have a full tutorial on the overdriver system. But for now, this is just what you need to know to get the basics going. Is that what we're doing is saying, just like a Maya constraint, this attachment point should control this IK handle. So we'll do that again. We'll expand the hierarchy from the reverse foot, find the attachment joint control, select the IK, say overdriver. This overdriver says, so there's a one to many and many to one, essentially, is what these are saying. So many drivers control one object, or one object controls many other objects. And when you only have two things selected, they essentially do the same thing. So now you've got your standard reverse foot set up. Along with all of our character stuff. Our regular FK. I think we're pretty happy with where this is at, so we can just hit save. Save out that rig. Alright. Oops. Alright, now use control solid shapes as our control shapes. This is so that we can define areas of a character and to make picking on them, or picking them, nice and easy. So instead of having a small spline-based control, we'll actually have boxes. These can be whatever shape you want them to be. You can directly modify the object shape itself. So if I go display shapes, so I can parent any other shape onto this and then delete this one if I need to, and it will create, or will use that shape. We'll save this off to a shapes file, essentially, after we're done doing a little bit of modeling. So if you don't want to model, you could just duplicate your character geometry and use that directly. And that's a little bit more work than doing some quick little box models. So for the demo purposes, I'm just going to do this. really whatever you want your shapes to look like. We can entirely model this thing. Kind of whatever amount of work that you feel like you need to give an animator good control, or if you are the animator, to give yourself good control. The idea of using these shapes instead of the splines, like I said, is so when you're working, instead of picking a small object at like the shoulder, I can just grab the actual limb of the character and start manipulating it. And some animators I've seen actually turn the transparency of all these things to pretty much almost nothing. So they're really just grabbing the limb, and they're able to see like the full character silhouette and everything while they work. It's pretty nice. So I won't go through the full setup here. I'll do that off camera and come back and show you saving these shapes and rebuilding the rig so that all the shapes, or show you that when you rebuild the rig, all the shapes just apply. So I will be back once that work is all done and ready to show you. Alright, and we're back. Instead of manually modeling all these out, I actually decided to take a little opportunity to show you a much easier way. For the first character you create, you're going to have to manually model at least a base set of like biped control shapes. But after you've got one set of biped shapes, you don't have to worry about recreating all of these shapes every time. Oops. You can just save off or use the control shapes file from any character and use them on every character. So instead of having to model out all these like little arrow shapes and all of that, I already have a character that has the full reverse foot, and I'm using all the same region names. That's the kind of important key here. So the file that I saved or brought this in from had a left arm, left clavicle, center spine, center pelvis. Actually, we have not rigged a cog yet. So it had a cog, had this nice shape with a cog. So since I already had a character with all these same regions defined with these same names, I'm able to just pull in a control shapes file from any character into the directory of the character that I'm working on, and it will read through and use those. And then I can just manually adjust the ones that I need. And we only have to do one side. There's a little bit of code here. This bit of code right here. It's just importing rigging. Actually, I'm not sure you need to import PyML core. This PM. And we'll keep it there just in case. And that's just for the general PyML command to list your selection. This is mirror control shapes. So rigging, rig base component, rig component, mirror control shapes. And this will just mirror the first control shape that you have selected. But after we run code once, Maya holds on to that code. And I can just hit G to repeat the command over and over for all of the shapes that I want to mirror. And then there's this code again, save control shapes off of that same base. This will go through and replace all the shapes that are in that existing file. That's where you're seeing this delete object over and over, is it found shapes that existed in that shapes file already, and then it's deleting those so that it can replace them with the ones that we've made here. But when you build a rig off of an animated character, these flags set themselves a lot more intelligently. Since this character doesn't have any animation, every time I build a rig component, it thinks that it doesn't need to be animated, or it sees that it's not animated, and flags it as only let animated controls be selected. It looks like I did not save. The rigging file with this control selected, or these constraints on the ankles. So I'm just going to redo that real quick. Again, with two things selected, it doesn't matter which one of these two buttons I press. You can also use the marking menu for this, or rig commands, space switch. I have a bad habit of closing windows before I'm done with them. So one extra little thing to show in this demo file is this add-ons section. So when I last opened it, we didn't have any overdrivers or add-ons, as they're called internally. So all we really had was each region and what it's defined as rigging by. So like reverse foot, the foot region is a reverse foot, is true in world space, and so on. With overdrivers applied, it's the same kind of convention. We're looking at the left leg, and the left leg has this overdriver, and then it tells carries the information of what object it's rigged and constrained to. So if you're constraining between two rig objects, I use a kind of convention, I suppose, to know what object to select. So I don't know, like the rigging system itself doesn't know that there are necessarily 3 joints in an arm. It just knows that there's an arm and it was rigged on something called arm, and maybe you have a character with 4 joints and some other characters have 3 joints, and whatever the system needs, whatever your characters need, I suppose. So the rig system looks at all those rig controls based off of their index in the hierarchy of that object. So what we're looking at here is actually saying the IK handle is the first IK handle defined. And that should be parented to, this lets it know that it's another rig object rather than just a floating scene object, so it knows that you use this as a rig lookup rather than as like a scene name. And then we're looking for the left foot reverse FK 0th joint, or so the very top or the very end joint of that chain. So like this would be 0, this would be 1. And you can see that data. If you look at the attribute editor, there's this control property. Every control has all the information of what type of control it is. The reverse foot is our reverse FK. This ordered index is 1 here, or 5 for the heel, and so on. Or like the toe control here is actually a little different, because it's called the toe IK control type of this reverse foot, and it's the only one, so it's a 0th indexed. So by basing this off of like the region and the index on the rigging component. I don't have to worry about there being a four-armed character or a four-jointed arm or a five-jointed arm or a three-jointed arm. The rigging system doesn't need to look at any of that. The only time it would fail in this case is if you try to load rigging from one character where that joint just doesn't exist on another character. So if you try to load rigging on that constraint on something with four joints, on something with three joints, and you had a constraint to that hand of the four-jointed arm, it just wouldn't build that constraint connection for you because it doesn't find that that thing exists. But I suppose that is pretty much everything that is involved in a character setup, as well as a couple little bugs and workarounds and modifications as you're working. And that's one thing I found that I really like using the system after having built it, is how, even just as a rigger, how flexible it is for me to do my work. Like, I can stop rigging midway through, make skeletal changes, make skeletal adjustments, reapply my rig, keep rigging, make skeletal changes, and just kind of go back and forth, and it's a really organic workflow rather than building out this big rig structure and just kind of locking everything in place and making that skeleton really difficult to modify. This lets everything stay, I guess, permeable to whatever changes you need. So if you need to add an extra joint for a specific type of rigging, then you can do that on the fly. If you needed to add joints for deformation, you could do that on the fly. And then just add the rigging as you need it and keep on moving along. Yeah, there we go. A full biped rig. Stretchy toes when he's not extending his leg. Now, I guess real quick before we are done here, I have not actually made the shapes for... Actually, I should just use the IK shapes. So each rigging component type, so arm, FK, IK, will have their own shapes, and will need to have their own shapes made. So for switching like this arm, let's do left arm, to IK, there's a couple of ways you can do that. You can just build an IK. Since remove existing is checked, it will bake the FK down and then rebuild the IK, baking that animation back up to the IK controls. Yeah, you can see this hand control is kind of wonky because it came from a different character in a different pose. You can also use the marking menu. In this marking menu, with any kind of rig command popped up, you can see what object you're working on. Load will do the same thing as load file. Load profile is just a quick way of finding files that are designated as for this character because they exist in his folder. And then all the rig commands you can do with the rigging. Again, more detailed videos to come on what all this does. But you can switch to FK here. You can also use IK-FK switch, which will just recognize which type of rigging you currently have and switch to the opposite one for you. Again, all your animation is baked every time you make any kind of switch, every time you make any kind of change to the rigging system, your animation is preserved. Oops. And you can go back and forth however you want. With that, we will call this little tutorial done. That is the full basic rigging setup of a biped with a reverse foot.